Hello, AP Comparative. Welcome back. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. I'm Mr. Andrew Canine. I teach in the north suburbs of Chicago, helping you make your way to that preparation for not the biggest, but I think the best AP social science test, and that is AP Comparative Government. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon, or whenever you're watching our AP Comparative Prep. We are making our way through the content that we know is fair game for our exam on May 22nd, this revised exam, because of these unsettling circumstances around coronavirus and quarantines and lockdowns. We are making our way through Unit 2, which is all about political institutions. We today are focused on topics 2.6 and 2.7. We're looking at legislatures, and we're looking at what structures of legislatures are. We're looking at what makes a legislature independent, what constrains the power of a legislature. And then tomorrow we're actually wrapping up Unit 2 as we look at judicial systems. So we spent a couple days on the executive, and yesterday on executive term limits and the removal of executive. Today is on the legislatures. We'll look at all 6 countries. And then tomorrow's judicial. And then we move into Unit 3. And as always, I would really suggest that you download materials from College Board, specifically the course description, in case your teacher did an awesome job prepping you up until that last time you saw your teacher in class. But your teacher covered this course more of a country by country, which is a very popular way to get students prepared. And it's absolutely a way that students can get prepared to be very successful in this exam. But the codes I'm using, the different units and the different lesson topic codes, are coming from the course description. So make sure you download a copy of the course description. Also provides really some specific content and definitions of what to know. More content I'm providing in these PowerPoint slides, you can access at the website that Mr. Larson and I created, citizenu.org. And Mr. Larson has been kind enough to create a comparative corner where you can download the texts, what we call the text messages of this material. And again, if you weren't aware of the test change or details, I would invite you to go to the website address that AP has provided that specifies what content, the units, the types of questions, and also the exam date and times for any of the APs that you were signed up to take. You, of course, are signed up to take AP Comparative Government. And of course, we start each of these broadcasts with shout outs. There were no There were no shout outs last night, although I did get a really nice message on Twitter from Bryn, who was complimentary of these review videos. So I'm super appreciative of that. I will tell you that yesterday we featured our first guest speaker, Mr. Michael Birnbaum, a reporter from the Washington Post, who was reporting about policies related to government responses to coronavirus and how that is in some cases kind of threatening to some democracies throughout the world. If you have a teacher that you think would be particularly adept at being a celebrity guest speaker for a short time on one of our upcoming broadcasts, make sure you recommend that teacher through Twitter at hashtag APCompGov2020. Specifically, we're looking for, on Thursday, we're starting what could be my favorite unit of study, and that's Unit 3, which is all about political culture and participation in our core country. Some incredibly rich and vibrant examples of how citizens participate and how the country's, what the political culture is, what civil society is like. So make your way through that Unit 3 course description that I showed you earlier, get a little preview of Unit 3. And if you know that your teacher had a particularly good lesson or example of civil society or the different topics in Unit 3, and you think they make a good celebrity guest here on AP Comparative Government, tweet out their name and I'll try to reach out, and we'll see if we can get some teachers as special celebrity guests here on the broadcast. I do want to thank, there was a great discussion, a great question. I love using social media to say what you know. I know I've been scoring some free responses from students who are giving me a hypothetical free responses and what their answers could be. So I'm able to give some feedback there. A great question on the difference between political stability and political legitimacy, which actually, thank you very much for asking that question, because it planted a seed for today's argument essay free response. But you should know that political stability really is about what government does in terms of the policies that it creates. Is government capable of satisfying popular demands, particularly with basic services? In some cases, a reduction on crime or the provision of key services that it takes civilization. Does the water turn on? Does the electric turn on? In other more sophisticated policies that a government might deliver. That's part of political stability. Or do they struggle with even the most basic parts of what governments are expected to deliver for their populations? Political legitimacy is less concrete. Political legitimacy is a psychological element. Political legitimacy is the belief by citizens that their government has the right to rule. That whether it be the government of China or the United Kingdom, does this government have the right to tell me what to do? That's more political legitimacy, which is more psychological concept. We're actually going to get into both of those concepts as a little preview of today's argument essay. And yesterday I solicited suggestions for the argument essay. Thank you again to Chris G for suggesting a terrific idea for an argument essay that deals with today's topic on legislative systems. And I took that idea, plus I know the student question about political stability and legitimacy. And here is a preview of this argument essay that I will try to answer for you in kind of a controversial way. I'm going to say, stay tuned for a little bit of controversy. And that is in AP Comparative Government. Different AP course countries have different legislative structures. Pretty standard here. Are unicameral or bicameral legislatures more effective at establishing political legitimacy? So here we're asking you to take at least one different concept, unicameral legislature, to understand what that is, to connect that to political legitimacy. But then you got to also connect at least one of these other core concepts into your argument, and at least one country to give a couple of different examples from, or two countries. So I will be working on this later in the lesson, but if you want to think about that argument essay, are unicameral or bicameral legislatures more effective at establishing political legitimacy? If you want to think about that as I go through the lesson, please do so. And kind of how would you develop an argument connecting a legislative structure to political legitimacy? Be a good way to prep for FRQ writing. Today we are talking about topics 2.6 and 2.7. We're looking at legislative structures. We're also looking at this concept of an independence of a legislature. We'll talk about what that means. Also, we'll look at how legislatures are constrained. In all of our countries, we see constraints on the legislative functions. We'll look at these different core countries, all 6 of them. We'll always connect. A big idea in AP Comparative Government is democratization. So this does link to that big idea. And we're going to get into some skills related to essay writing in a traditional argument essay. I'll explain that in a moment. Like I said, we are making our way through Unit 2. Starting on Thursday, 2 days from now, we'll be getting into Unit 3. And then I'll do a quick recap of Unit 4, Unit 5, and some short reviews over all 5 of these lessons before we end our lessons on May the 1st. We always start what you need to know with critical vocabulary. And today, the course description, if you go through the course description, we see there's 3 real essential vocab words that you should know when it comes to legislatures. And one is unicameral, which is what we call a one-chamber legislature, where there's only one house, so to speak, or bicameral, and that's when there are 2 chambers. And sometimes students struggle with that. Remember, a unicycle has one wheel. And of course, we know that a bicycle has two wheels. Forgive the teacher dad joke. We know that a unibrow is a one eyebrow. And so what do we call two eyebrows? Of course, we should call them bibrows to understand that. Anyway, you should also know the word parliamentary hybrid, and this is a synonym, parliamentary hybrid. I don't know if I use this particularly in my class, but the synonym that you might be more familiar with, particularly as it relates to Russia, is that parliamentary hybrid is a synonym for semi-presidential system. So this is similar, or it is the Russian governmental system, where you have a directly elected president who's able to appoint the prime minister for the lower chamber of the legislature, and the lower chamber has to approve that prime minister. That's sometimes called a parliamentary hybrid as it relates to Russia. You should know some specific content in terms of the structures of the legislatures in all 6 AP comparative countries. The key that you should know is that anything with an asterisk is straight from the AP course description. So I'm gonna give probably a little bit more detailed content. In this institutions unit, you're gonna see there's more detailed descriptions in the course description about what you should know. Anything with an asterisk comes straight from the course description. And then I add some supplemental information, particularly today I'm going to go into some supplemental on how these members of the legislature actually get these jobs. That's actually more content from Unit 4 in terms of the election systems that are used to elect members of the House of Commons or the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico. But I put that in here too. I think it's important for you to see, like we did with the executives, to see how do they get these jobs. So, but things with an asterisk, content with an asterisk, that is straight from the course description. So make sure you study up on some of these details. So with China, you should definitely know that China is unicameral, and the name of that unicameral legislature is the National People's Congress. It's almost 3,000 members. It's enormous, which also reflects the very large population of China. What's really interesting about the National People's Congress is when you read the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, the Constitution would indicate that this national legislature, the National People's Congress, is the most powerful governing entity in China. And so on paper, the Constitution would want us to believe that this is the most powerful political institution. And yet we know that the party, the Communist Party, and specifically the Politburo of the Communist Party are actually the real power centers of where decisions come from in China's national government. Nonetheless, the legislature plays the same function of legislatures in all of our countries, in almost every country, and that is the legislature approves, it legitimizes policies, say they write laws. We know the executive pushes out these policies, but it's actually up to the legislature to give to sign off. And so that's a function of all legislatures, that they write policies. In China's specific case, we also know that the legislature does elect the president and approves the premier. We can debate, well, we can't debate. The reality is that the National People's Congress has never elected a president that the Communist Party didn't want to be the president. So that's how the power moves. It does not go bottom up in China, it goes top down. The members of the National People's Congress do serve 5-year terms. They are technically elected is a strong word to use. They're indirectly elected through a series of different regional assemblies. Not every member of the National People's Congress is a member of the Communist Party. There are actually other parties in China. None of those other parties is allowed to contest or challenge the Communist Party for power. There are some members of the National People's Congress who are unaffiliated with any party, including the Communist Party. But rest assured, the Communist Party controls who gets into this chamber, and specifically wants this chamber to be approving the executive's policies. That's how power goes, from the top down. The National People's Congress does elect the president as the head of state and approves the appointment of the premier as the head of government. I mentioned that before. A word you often see when it comes to more authoritarian governments and the role of the legislature is that the National People's Congress works as a rubber stamp. And that's a metaphor for essentially they approve every policy that the executive is suggesting. Sometimes you see in years past, maybe some disagreement, but we can measure that by debates or suggestions for amendments that weren't in the initial legislation. But if the executive wants it, the national legislature, that unicameral National People's Congress, is going to approve that policy in China. And one of the other interesting details, and I just find this fascinating, again, it's almost 3,000 members. They only meet for 2 weeks a year. And so that's a really busy 2 weeks of approving legislation. That's one of the ways you can measure the power of an institution. Is this a full year institution? Do they meet consistently throughout the year? Or is that meeting time really condensed into a very short period of time? And typically, when it's condensed into a short period of time, we know that this institution really doesn't have as much power as what might be in writing. And that's the way that the National People's Congress works. Iran has also a unicameral legislature. It's called the Majlis. And it is elected, it's directly elected, and holds the power to approve legislation like all these legislations do. It oversees the budget, which again is a very familiar role of what we know national legislatures do. It confirms presidential nominees to the cabinet. That's also something that we see in a number of these different countries. What is very unique in Iran's national legislature is that there is a body, a government entity called the Guardian Council, that oversees what the Majlis does. And I wouldn't call it necessarily an upper chamber because Iran is considered to be a unicameral system. But the Guardian Council, they do what their name says, they guard. And they want to make sure that the policies of the government, that the laws passed by the national legislature uphold and are compatible with Sharia law and Shia Islam. That's what the Guardian Council does. And so for essentially the last 15 years, the Majlis really doesn't pass any policies that are controversial, that would go against the supreme leader, that would be a policy that the Guardian Council doesn't approve of. And we'll make a note here down below that the Guardian Council essentially is the supreme leader's organization. The supreme leader appoints half the members of the Guardian Council. I believe there's 12 of them. The other half are named by the head of the judiciary in Iran, but we know the head of the judiciary gets his job from the supreme leader. So essentially the Guardian Council is the entity controlled by the supreme leader. So no policy is getting past the Majlis that the Guardian Council doesn't approve of. And just to make sure that the Majlis is controlled, we know that there are elections. They are elected and they have 4-year terms. And they have an interesting system, a hybrid system of single-member district and multi-member district. But the reality is that any member these days who's even up for election in the national legislature is approved by the Guardian Council. So not only is the Guardian Council supervising the legislation that's passed by the national legislature, they're also supervising who is even eligible for the elections in the national legislature. So a lot of constraints in Iran on their national legislature. Mexico is, they have a Congress, and it's a Congress that's very, it also looks a lot like Nigeria's Congress and presidential system. It is bicameral. They have a lower chamber called the Chamber of Deputies. They approve legislation, they levy taxes. One of the unique features of the Chamber of Deputies is that they verify the outcomes of elections in Mexico. The Senate is the upper chamber of Mexico's legislature. They confirm presidential appointments. particularly to the Supreme Court. They approve treaties. They also approve if there's going to be national intervention in state matters. So some of those roles would be really familiar to you if you know about US government and the roles of the US House versus the US Senate. And you'll see some similarities also with Nigeria's national legislature. So the Chamber of Deputies, again, how do they get these jobs? This is more content from Unit 4. I just put in some specific notes in case you're interested. They do have elections. They are directly elected, excuse me, not directly. There's a hybrid system in the Chamber of Deputies where part of the Chamber of Deputies is directly elected in single member districts. And the other part is they win their seats through proportional representation, or what we call party list votes. If those are terms that are unfamiliar to you, those are terms that we'll see more in Unit 4. But there are term limits in Mexico, and there are elections on how you get both to the Chamber of Deputies and also Mexico's upper chamber, the Senate. The Senate has 6-year terms. There are 3 senators per state, which is a really unique system for Mexico's upper chamber. What is also unique in both the lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, and Mexico's upper chamber, for almost the entire constitutional history of Mexico since 1917, there were strict one-term limits for members of the legislature. So Mexico had this really unique system for most of its political history, where the president could only serve 1 6-year term, each senator could only serve 1 6-year term, each member of the Chamber of Deputies can only serve 1 3-year term. That was changed in 2015. The president still has the 1 6-year term called the sexenio, but now representatives in the Congress can serve up to 12 years. So there are 4 3-year terms in the Chamber of Deputies and 2 6-year terms in the Senate. So they've relaxed those term limits when it comes to legislators in Mexico. Nigeria, like I mentioned before, they also have a bicameral congressional presidential system. Their lower chamber is the House of Representatives, their upper chamber is the Senate, approve legislation, and the Senate possesses unique impeachment and confirmation powers. Again, similar rules as what we see in the United States Constitution with the US Senate. Nigeria's House of Representatives is considered the lower chamber. It is directly elected with single member district elections. And then we see Nigeria's Senate also has those 3 senators per state in what we would call multi-member districts. And the Senate is more responsible in Nigeria for holding the cabinet accountable, particularly overseeing the implementation of policy by the executive bureaucracy. And like I mentioned before, has unique impeachment and confirmation powers in Nigeria's upper chamber, the Senate. Russia, that term I was mentioning before, is the parliamentary hybrid system. It is considered to be bicameral. The State Duma is elected, and it's the primary chamber that passes legislation. It also, the lower chamber, confirms the president's appointment to prime minister. So the president, who's elected in a separate election, would nominate a prime minister, and that prime minister would have to be approved by the Duma. The upper chamber, the Federation Council, is appointed. It is considered to be a much weaker upper chamber, although it does approve some budget legislation, treaties, and anytime there is a question about troop deployment in Russia, the Federation Council, their upper chamber, makes those calls. The Duma elections, I don't even want to get into the details of how these have changed over time, but it is elected. And at this point, it has gone back to what it was originally, and that is a hybrid election system where those elections are partially single member district, what we call first past the post, and partially party list elections, what we sometimes call proportional elections. And who knows what's going to happen with constitutional changes in Russia. But that's the way it is currently in Russia's national legislature. The United Kingdom is considered to be bicameral. Its lower chamber is enormously more powerful than its upper chamber. The lower chamber is called the House of Commons. It approves legislation and also selects the prime minister. Technically, in the United Kingdom, the monarch has to approve the House of Commons selection for the prime minister. So it's kind of a backwards of what we see in Russia, where the head of state nominates the prime minister, and then that selection has to be approved by the lower chamber in Russia. In the United Kingdom, it's actually the lower chamber that has the power to appoint, if you will, and then the head of state in the United Kingdom, the monarch, has to approve. The House of Lords is just a review group. It reviews legislation, it can suggest amendments, it can slightly delay legislation, although not for a very long time. It's a weaker upper chamber, and the House of Lords is entirely appointed. So again, you know, when we talk about democratic institutions, the United Kingdom sometimes is a tricky government to understand because we mentioned before, they have a monarch who certainly is not elected. The upper chamber is appointed. They are not elected. They're appointed by the elected House of Commons. So that would be an element of democracy with the House of Lords. But really the power of the House of the United Kingdom really rests with the House of Commons. It's a much stronger lower chamber. It is directly elected in what we call first past the post elections. First past the post is a synonym for single member district elections, where there's only one winner per district, or what they call in the United Kingdom constituencies. And we do know that a key power of the House of Commons is that it can remove the prime minister with what's called a vote of no confidence, which is rare, but it definitely is a potential power of the House of Commons over the executive. Which takes us into what is the relationship between legislatures and the executives, and you know, and how would you determine if a legislature is independent? So we know that, as I was mentioning before, even though the Constitution in China indicates that the National People's Congress, this unicameral legislature, is the power center, we know the actual center of power in China is China's Politburo Standing Committee. That the key decisions of China's state, of their government, are made by the party's Politburo Standing Committee. We know that when the National People's Congress is not in session, which is most of the year, they only meet 2 weeks out of the year, it's actually the Standing Committee of the NPC, of the National People's Congress, that actually is doing the legislative duties of China's legislature. So that's for 50 weeks of the year, the Standing Committee of the legislature is passing those policies. And they supervise elections of the NPC members, and they interpret the constitutional laws, acting almost in that case as a court in China. So that's really where the power is. The Politburo Standing Committee of the party and the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. Again, much more top down than what it looks like in the Constitution. In Iran, in addition to the Guardian Council, there is a group called the Expediency Council. They are appointed by the supreme leader, and they act as an advisory committee. If in the past, it was much more common that the Majlis would pass policies that the Guardian Council would disagree with. And it was this group called the Expediency Council that would kind of negotiate compromises between the Majlis, the national legislature, and the supervisory group called the Guardian Council. My understanding is that you don't see those kinds of disputes in the last 10, 15 years in Iran, because the Guardian Council is so much more effective at vetting who the candidates are, who are even eligible to be elected in the Majlis. So you don't see those types of policy disputes that the Expediency Council really has to intervene on. But those are some terms we know that are fair game in the course description when it comes to Iran. As I mentioned before, Iran's Guardian Council does select candidates or filters candidates who are up for election in the Majlis. I should note that Mexico, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom, when we talk about independent legislatures, they're definitely in AP comparative government. Those are the 3 countries of the 6 that are considered to be more independent, that are much more likely to say no to the executive, that have a potential In the case of Mexico and Nigeria, there's a potential for what we would call divided government in the United States, where a party who's opposed to the president's party could be rejecting presidential policies. That's could happen and has happened to a degree, we know in Mexico. We know that in Nigeria and the United Kingdom, there are powers to hold the executive accountable, that we know that there are examples of those legislatures holding the executive accountable and rejecting some policies from the executive. So look no further than the United Kingdom. We know that typically the House of Commons approves policies from the Prime Minister, since the Prime Minister is the leader of the party, the majority party of the House of Commons. But in 2019, that was really tricky for Boris Johnson to get Brexit policies through. He actually was considering just using the executive authority of the Prime Minister to get those policies through. And there was actually a discussion, a really interesting political science discussion. Could the Prime Minister just force policies through, particularly related to Brexit and withdrawal from the European Union? There were some political scientists and historians who were saying, yeah, that really the only effective constraint of the executive power in the United Kingdom is Commons' ability to vote no confidence in the Prime Minister. So it was really interesting, some current events that were going on in the fall. We know that in Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia all have presidents, and all those presidents have these unique powers to use decrees, or I guess some systems call these executive orders. These are commands or decrees, mandates by the president to the executive branch on how laws should be implemented, how they should be enforced. And in some cases, essentially, these have the power of law. We note that a lot of presidential systems allow their chief executive to have this power of executive decrees, which kind of goes against some of the actions that maybe in some cases the legislature passed. So those are some of the relationships we see between the legislative branch and the executive branches. And then finally, legislatures do have the potential to reinforce legitimacy and stability by responding to public demands, to debating policy, to facilitating compromises, extending civil liberties, and restricting the power of the executive. So that's how sometimes the work of a legislature can be connected to political legitimacy, which is a preview of our argument essay today and some of our questions. So if you have examples of how legislatures characterize AP comparative government core countries, please use our Twitter hashtag at #APCompGov2020. And I do have a series of questions I'm going to go through quickly, particularly these multiple choice. We always try to do 4 or 5 multiple choice and get into a FRQ to help you with your writing skills. So which is the correct pairing of countries to features of their legislative branch? We have bicameral on the left column, and we have unicameral on the right. And hopefully you know that Mexico is bicameral, while Iran is considered to be unicameral. And here we have, which is the correct pairing of Nigeria. Look at, oh, tricky. Nigeria's national legislature. How closely were you paying attention? Which approves legislation and which holds the cabinet accountable for implementing policies. And we know that both the House of Representatives and the Senate are responsible for approving legislation and for holding the cabinet accountable for implementing policies in Nigeria. How about Russia? When you're looking at Russia's national legislature, which chamber confirms the prime minister and which ratifies treaty? And if you're paying attention, the Duma confirms the prime minister, and it's actually the Federation Council, the upper chamber, that ratifies treaties in Russia. Which is the most accurate description of how a national legislature can enhance political legitimacy? And the answer here is by extending civil liberties and can constrain the powers of an executive authority. That is how the role of a legislature can enhance political legitimacy. Same question, different options. Which is the most accurate description of how a national legislature can enhance legitimacy? And in this case, you should know that a legislature can openly debate policies and actually facilitate compromises between factions in the political landscape. So those are some multiple choice. We know that this revised exam will have no multiple choice questions in 2020. Instead, there will be 2 FRQs. We know that one of those FRQs will replicate what's called the argument essay. If your teachers have given you argument essays, sometimes they might have called this FRQ number 4. There are certain skills that you have to do, and particularly building a thesis, supporting that thesis with evidence, using reasoning. What you do not have to do is provide an alternative perspective and a counter argument to that alternative perspective. And that brings up the controversy today, is that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a unique way that this can be done in a constructive way to get points in your thesis. So the question today I showed you before. Thank you for those students who are collaborating with this on hashtag APCompGov 2020. In comparative government, different AP course countries have different legislative structures. Are unicameral or bicameral legislatures more effective at establishing political legitimacy? Use one or more of the following course concepts in your response. If you remember yesterday, I forgot to do that initially. I forgot to put those course concepts in my thesis and in my evidence paragraphs. I did not forget to do that today. So always keep your eye. Usually there's at least 3 concepts that you got to intertwine into your writing. In this case, you either have to pick either unicameral or bicameral. You have to connect that to political legitimacy. You got to intertwine at least one of these words in. Plus, you have to use 2 evidence from countries. It could be from one country, 2 different pieces of evidence, or it can be from 2 different countries. Today, I'll show you evidence from 2 different countries. So that is explaining more. Again, this FRQ is worth up to 7 points, 1 point for the thesis. And I like to describe essentially the evidence paragraphs are worth up to 3 points each, where you can get those 3 points for using the country example, connecting it to the core concept, and using reasoning, elaborating on your reason to get up to 3 points for each of the evidence paragraphs. So 2 evidence paragraphs, 3 points each, 6 points there, but you got to have that thesis. If you don't have the thesis, the whole thing, you just can't hit the points if you don't hit the thesis. So I'm going to show you a way to do that today. So I have a couple students, they love when they write these argument essays, they love to test the rubric. And again, they're going back to the traditional argument essay rubric. Traditionally, this FRQ number 4, the argument essay, has to include an alternative perspective and a response to that alternative perspective. And they have a unique way of writing. So I want to try to replicate those students. Aaron Fitzgerald was great at this, is great at this, of putting in the counter argument, the alternative perspective, in the opening kind of thesis paragraph. And she did terrific on this. So I tried to replicate some of that good writing I've seen from students, where I responded to some people claim that bicameral legislatures are more effective at establishing political legitimacy because these types of legislators can provide more opportunities for political participation. It's one of the core concepts. But I actually believe that unicameral legislatures are more effective at establishing political legitimacy because these types of legislatures are more capable of passing uniform policies that can create stronger political stability. All I'm doing, again, you're not going to get a point for adding an alternative perspective. There is no unicorn. Don't believe the rumors that you can score a 6 on this year's AP exam. I know there's a lot of changes, but there's no 6s out there on the overall AP exam. However, you can put an alternative perspective in there as a way of writing your thesis. And that's essentially what I did here. I know there's some teachers who are going to really, this might be a little controversial, But I wanted to show you just some writing styles that I've seen from students that I think does a good job of setting up the thesis. So my thesis is that it's unicameral legislatures that build effective political legitimacy. And I connect that into one of my core concepts here, where I'm going to be focused on political stability. And my first piece of evidence is going to come from China. China has a unicameral system that I'm going to argue is more effective at establishing legitimacy. Again, because it's more capable of passing uniform policies. You don't have a disagreement between chambers. And this can create stronger political stability. And then I show what I know about China. I kind of show off a little bit. I know that there's one chamber. It's called the National People's Congress. I'm showing off. I'm sorry. It meets just 2 weeks a year. And there is little policy disagreement between this one chamber and policies proposed by the executive. But I want to reemphasize my reasoning. I underline for you to see that I need to have reasons that this is supporting my thesis. So I want to intertwine my thesis in there, which I do a couple different times, and I want to show reasoning. So I'm using my reasoning words because, all right, reemphasize my reasoning here, thereby. This policy of uniformity can build political stability, which can thereby be more effective at establishing political legitimacy, as many citizens affirm that these uniform policies result in greater GDP growth in China. We know that GDP growth and this consistent GDP growth over the last 40 years has certainly helped the legitimacy of China's government. So I connect that into my argument as part of my reason and evidence specific to China. My other evidence I'm picking is Iran. Iran's another system with a unicameral system, unicameral legislature. Maybe, oops, I should have put unicameral legislature. I need to fix that. So Iran is another example of a system with a unicameral, we'll change that to legislature, that is more effective at establishing political legitimacy because I have to have my reason word. This type of legislature is more capable of passing uniform policies that can create stronger political stability. That reason should look familiar. I can repeat that with a different country because I'm using evidence from that second country. I'm now talking about Iran's modulus as a one-chamber legislature, and that the policies have to be approved by the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council. So I'm giving specific evidence from Iran that this creates policy uniformity that can build stability, which can thereby be more effective at establishing political legitimacy. You're going to see some repetition in my thesis, but that's my thesis. I'm supporting that. And my reason is that many citizens affirm that these uniform policies from the modulus are in keeping with Shia Islam. That's the whole role of the Guardian Council and the Supreme Leader. That's what the Constitution tells them to do, is to make sure the government is compatible and the laws from the modulus are compatible with Shia Islam. And that's part of the political legitimacy of Iran's system. So that's how a kind of a different way of creating a thesis. I'm not sure if that might be intimidating for you, but I've seen some students do that with the traditional rubric where there was an alternative perspective. And that's the way they also kind of introduce their thesis, if you will. But really important, have that clear thesis, have those reasoning words, and don't be shy about elaborating on country evidence in your argument essay. Do me a favor, if you want to try to write that same argument essay, but if you want to argue the opposite, if you want to argue that a bicameral legislature is more effective at establishing political legitimacy, if you want to put some examples of that on Twitter at #APCompGov2020, I'll try to have some time to give you feedback on a couple of those if you want to try to argue the opposite, that a bicameral legislature is more effective at establishing political legitimacy. So today we were looking at critical words related to legislatures in our AP 6 countries, unicameral, bicameral, and for Russia, the parliamentary hybrid system. We have seen in the past in Unit 1 connections between today's topic, particularly the independence of legislatures, when we compare democracies with more authoritarian governments in this whole process of democratization that some of our countries have undergone. And we'll see more examples of this in Unit 3.6 when we talk about political participation. Tomorrow, we are wrapping up Unit 2. We'll be looking at judicial systems. And we want to know what are some key characteristics of an independent judiciary. So when we talk about independence of branches, what would you say are some key characteristics of an independent judiciary? You can tweet examples of that at #APCompGov2020. Thank you for tuning in. Please, if you know someone who's struggling with access to technology, invite them to reach out to the College Board. Again, tomorrow we're wrapping up Unit 2, and I really appreciate you tuning in today, and have a wonderful evening and be well.